Hello everyone. Welcome to Development Economics 2. As you know, the topic of our discussion today is financial instability in a globalized world. As the title suggests, there are two important aspects in the very topic itself. One is the idea of financial instability, and the other important aspect is in a context of globalized world. That is why we will talk about the idea of globalization a bit carefully, and then we'll move on to the discussion of financial instability in later classes. Today, we shall focus more on the idea of globalization. Therefore, today's learning objectives are as follows. We will talk about the broad meaning of globalization, and then we will briefly discuss about what are the potential consequences of globalization. Then we will talk about different episodes or different eras of globalization. And finally, in our session today, we will talk about the liberalization of capital markets in the context of globalization. Okay. Now, globalization is kind of a buzzword. It has been around for a while now, and you have heard about it many places, right? It can be in political debates, it can be in economic debates, and so on. Now, there is a long-standing debate when it comes to the idea of globalization, especially with regard to its consequences and more so with regard to the developing countries. Is it good for the developing countries? Is it bad for the developing countries? But there are, of course, various perspectives in this regard. Now, globalization is an idea which has actually various aspects, which will be clear as we go along. It's not just one way to look at it. There are many ways to look at it, and we will briefly talk about those issues as well. Now, when it comes to economics, globalization is primarily concerned about global integration, trade liberalization, financial liberalization, and deeper interconnectedness among different countries. Now, this itself, the deeper interconnectedness and the extent and the intensity of connectedness, these all really matter for the case of financial instability. And that's exactly why this whole idea of financial instability is such a big deal, because since countries are interconnected, something goes wrong somewhere, it can spread very easily to other countries. For example, let's think of the global financial crisis of 2008. It originated in the United States, but it affected many other developed as well as developing countries, including India. Okay, what you see on your screen right now is called Google Ngram Viewer. What does it show us? You can see on the horizontal axis, we have the year. And on the vertical axis, we are measuring the percentage of time the word globalization appears in the books written in English, in the title of the books written in English. So let's say there are 100 books which are written in English. In how many of them the title of the books carries the word globalization? And as you can see clearly, it is since the 1980s, more so in the mid to late 1980s onwards, that it shot up. It went up, to a great deal. The whole appearance of the word globalization in the books written in English, in the title of the books written in English, with a relative fall in the recent past. So clearly, the idea of globalization gained some sort of popularity, as can be indicated by the Google Ngram Viewer, in the late 19th century onwards. What you see on your screen right now is a very interesting thing. We travel by aircraft, right? We go from one place to another place, and we think the aeroplane connects, different parts of the world. It does in different ways, actually. If you look at in a screen, what you see that different parts of an aircraft is actually being supplied by different countries. Let's think of the wingtip of a aircraft. The wingtips are produced by a company named KAA, which is a Korean company. Then if you look at, for example, the wing, it's produced by a Japanese company. Okay, let's think of a door which is kind of produced by a company which is in France. So clearly, if you look at one aircraft, this is 787 Dreamliner, and what we are showing on your screen is the structure supplier, you can see one single aircraft, different parts of it are being produced by different countries. Now, this one example is good enough to tell us that how the world is deeply connected through globalization. Well, immediately, since the countries are globally connected this way, what you see on your screen makes a lot of sense. Recently, the Silicon Valley Bank has collapsed. And as the news headlines are arguing, collapse of Silicon Valley Bank to impact Indian startup ecosystem, that's what the experts are arguing. Also, the other news item is saying that there's a fear that what if this collapse has an impact on other countries. So there's a lot of fear on that because the countries are interconnected. So these are some of the ways to motivate what we're going to talk about today. Now let's move on to defining the idea of globalization. Now, if you think of the idea of globalization, it is one of the most frequently used words. But what happens generally is, in many cases, the frequently used words are kind of misunderstood. So we use the word in case of discussions of development, trade, international relationship, etc. And then you also see the word in a very popular discourse. It could be in press, it could be in academia. They actually talk about this whole idea of globalization as a process, as a condition, as a system, a force, and an age. For example, we say the expression like age of globalization. We say the process of globalization. Now, the term globalization applies to a set of social processes, that appear to transform. Now, mind the word, it's a set of social processes that appear to transform our present social condition of conventional nationality. Like you belong to a certain country, you have a certain nationality, it transforms that into one of globality, right? So it's, of course, you belong to you have your own national identity, but you also have the global identity now, right? Now, this is by no means a static process. It's a very dynamic process. If we think of the economic and non-economic aspects of globalization, one of the most easily relatable example would be consumption culture. There's a global culture that is emerging. For example, today you do not only follow, let's say, the Indian cinema. You also follow the other cinema produced by the other countries. Similarly, the other people from other countries, not just Indians abroad, the people from other countries actually, they also follow Indian cinema. Right? So there's a emerging global culture. So people could be consuming similar goods. You have McD's everywhere. You have Subways everywhere. Now, therefore, you can see this in case of the consumer culture, in case of entertainment, also in case of language. English as a language has become so popular as an official language. Now, it actually also connects various regions and spaces of the world, which can be very far off from each other. They have very different history, but then they may have lot of similarities coming up. For example, if you enter a shopping mall, it kind of becomes very difficult to identify whether the shopping mall is in New York or is in Kolkata or is in Delhi or in Bangalore, right? Unless you look at all the other surrounding. The spaces are also becoming somewhat similar with their own local context blended in it. However, the core economic meaning is that globalization refers to the increased openness of economies to international trade, financial flows, and direct foreign investment. The growing interconnectedness of all kinds across national governments and firms and directly between peoples is a process that therefore affects everyone in the world. As we've been telling from the very beginning, it's an interconnected world. Something happens somewhere. It's not that you will remain unaffected. There's a very high chance that you may be affected by something that happens very far off. Now, this has impact for both developed and developing countries. What you see on your screen is actually borrowed from a Buddhist parable. The story goes like this. Some blind men, they set out on a journey to identify what is an elephant, So what happens is, one of them holds the leg, one of them, touches the belly, one of them holds the tail, one of them holds the trunk, one of them holds the ear. So as a result, what happens is they have very different understanding of what an elephant is. The man who holds the leg thinks that elephant is like a tree. So somebody who holds the ear of the elephant thinks it's like a fan. So it's like a wing. So what happens is the perspective that you take, you think that is the whole perspective. Similarly is the case with globalization. So some people believe it's more about the economics, some say it's more about the culture, some say it's more about the politics, some say it's more about the environmental issues, some say it's more about the ideology. Well, they're all right partially. Globalization is kind of all of this put together. So while we will focus on the economic aspect of it, we will not forget the idea that it's a comprehensive thing, it's a holistic thing that we need to keep in mind, that it's not only economic, it's also political, social, cultural, etc. So there are multiple definitions of globalization as appear on your screen. Now the Anthony Giddens offered this definition, and I read, globalization can thus be defined as the intensification of worldwide social relations which link distant localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away and vice versa. We have discussed this idea before. And the other definition is talking about some sort of transformation that is happening, right? And it's also about the extensity, intensity, velocity, and impact. The third that is appearing on your screen is that globalization as a concept refers both to the compression of the world and the intensification of consciousness of the world as a whole. Okay, time for you to think about this question. What is meant by globalization? Now, as we have discussed already, there are various ways to look at globalization, but in economics, we have our certain way of looking at globalization. We have also presented, as you can go back and see, there are multiple definitions of globalization, and these are not exactly economic definition of globalization, but we presented this so that you get the holistic understanding. Now we come to the next discussion, which is the consequences of globalization. Of course, as always, there will be benefits of globalization, there will be costs of globalization. So let's first look at the benefits of globalization. As some people would argue, there are new possibilities for broad-based economic development. It also opens up, various kinds of interactions with people in other countries. As a result, what happens? Globalization, therefore, can potentially benefit poor countries relatively more in terms of directly and indirectly. Let's say, for example, through cultural, economic, social, scientific, and technological exchanges, and also through conventional trade and the route of finance. We have made the word finance a little bold because that's our focus here today. So what they're arguing is, that as this exchange happens, it benefits the relatively poorer parts of the world. It also helps people, their income rises and so on. One, for example, argument is that with international trade liberalization, there is an efficiency gain that happens here. And think about it, there is a new technology that comes up, let's say in the West, right? Somewhere in the West. It should not take very long time to reach other parts of the world. Or let's say something happens somewhere in Europe, some new innovation happens somewhere in Asia, it will easily flow to other parts of the world. So the technology knowledge diffusion happens very quickly. So therefore what we are arguing here, a faster diffusion of productive ideas, and such as a shorter time between innovation and adoption of new technologies around the world, mind the word around the world, this might help developing countries catch up more quickly. Catch up as in catch up with the developed nations. Well, as we have discussed this, there's a last point on the screen as you see. Some scholars would like to argue the world is so deeply interconnected that it's very difficult that they'll get into a war. We have put a question mark there because some of the recent incidents raise a question about this whole idea. Okay, the critical aspects of the globalization are as follows. Now, it can be the case that the poorer countries are locked into a pattern of dependence on the developed nations. There can be deepening of the existing dualism within developing countries, the increasing gap between the rural-urban, the increasing gap between, let's say, the formal and informal sector, the subsistence and productive sector, and so on. And some poorer countries or some poor people in some countries can be left behind. The globalization may bypass them. Now, many people living in poverty could actually find it difficult to benefit from the process of globalization unless it kind of meet for example, something like a standard human capital that needs to be maintained. This is where the government has to step in and help out. Otherwise, they'll, as it said, they'll miss the bus. Inequalities may be accentuated between countries or also within countries. Now, follow this line. All countries may be affected by increased vulnerability. All countries may be affected by increased vulnerability to capital flows. As we have mentioned before, the 2008 financial crisis has shown, developed countries, all were affected, although it originated in the developed countries. All countries may experience certain threats to their cultural identities. you may feel that you're losing your own cultural identity because of this whole flow of different cultures coming together. Now, it's a very complex process. There's no one answer to this kind of question. But the developing countries are also very concerned about this. No wonder we talk about the environmental degradation, which can be accelerated, because you can see the whole debate around climate crisis, global warming, and so on, more so in the post-globalization era. And there is a concern that there can be international dominance of the richest countries in the whole process. However, we have presented before as well that there is a possibility of catching up or convergences. For example, you can think of India and China. They have really grown comparatively better than many countries in the world, especially as they embraced trade liberalization and so on. However, the issue of inequality remained a major concern, increasing inequality within these countries. Nevertheless, this point that appears on your screen, that globalization then and now, by then it is implied the colonial era, for example, is there a difference between these two kind of globalization? There's a concern that, okay, when you are really concerned about the process of globalization, you have historical evidences that why you should be concerned about the process of globalization. There's a history of colonialism that raises certain doubt, right? So what happens is, during the colonial era, the worst affected areas were Africa, and they're still reeling. So the argument that there will be a widespread general benefits from at least some form of globalization today, that needs to be verified, and that really is dependent on this whole idea that there's something different about the current wave. No, but it's not really enough to say that this globalization is different. You really have to have some sort of evidence for that. And there has to be proper policies at place which kind of guarantees that this is different from earlier period of globalization, especially with regard to the colonial era. Now, the critics have this idea. They actually say that today's globalization is only superficially different. It's still the dominance of the richest countries, the countries of the West, and so on and so forth. Now, the claim that things are different this time, that must stand or fall on evidence that there are now effective rules of the game for international trade, investment, finance, and assistance to the poor. Or if not, that these rules are steadily, convincingly, and irreversibly being put into place. Let's look at this very interesting comment by Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus. He said in 2008, and I read, "Global trade is like a 100-lane highway crisscrossing the world." Think about a 100-lane highway crisscrossing the world. If it is a free-for-all highway, there's no rule, right? With no stoplight, with no speed limits, there's no size restrictions or even lane markers, its surface will be taken over by the giant trucks from the world's most powerful economies. So unless you have proper rules at place, what will happen is that free flow for everyone. But what you'll see at the end of the day is the big guys who have occupied the road, which means the developed nations can actually benefit a lot more. The developing countries may not benefit comparatively, and it can be disproportionately against the interests of the developing countries unless proper rules and regulations are at place. Okay, now a question for you. Think of two potential positive and potential negative consequences of globalization. I'm sure you can find that out once you go back to some of our discussions that we just had in the previous slides. Now we come to this aspect of different eras of globalization. Now, if you think that globalization is just happening today or in the last 30, 40 years, that's not the case. Historians or different thinkers have identified different eras or episodes of globalization, and we will not get into a greater discussion or detailed discussion of that. We'll briefly present some of those episodes. The prehistoric period, which is 10,000 BCE to 3,500 BCE. What we have here, as you can understand, the scope of globalization was severely limited, right? One can say it's actually a kind of era of divergence. People have moved from different places from one places to different places. There have not been much of convergence, rather. So what happens towards the end of this particular era is you see that centrally administered forms of agriculture, religion, bureaucracy, and warfare slowly emerged. And therefore, you have a lot of social exchanges coming up towards the end of this particular era, which is the prehistoric period. Then comes the premodern period, which is 3500 BCE to 1500 CE. What happens during this era? Towards the end of this particular era, several interlocking trade circuits have actually come up, which actually connects the Eurasia and northeastern Africa. Now, also what happens during this era is there's a massive waves of migration. You see a lot of urban centers coming up. There's a growth, urban growth in that way. Urbanization is happening. And very interestingly, a lot of localized religions become world religions during this particular era of globalization. Unfortunately, this era also marks the time where you have the spread of infectious diseases. For example, the bubonic plague. Like today, we have had this whole episode of the pandemic. It was much worse then, and it was this era which gave rise to some of those spread of those diseases. Now comes the early modern period rather, between 1500 to 1750. Now the word early modern, they actually refer to the period between the European Renaissance and the Enlightenment. What happens in this era is that Europe and its social practices emerged as the primary catalyst for globalization. And mind this, after a long period of Asian predominance. Asia had been really dominant for a long time. It is this particular episode that brings Europe in the center, and kind of Europe really takes over the global landscape of all these developments. Then comes the modern period, which ranges between 1750 and 1980. By the late 18th century, Australia and the Pacific Islands were slowly incorporated into the European-dominated network of political, economic, and cultural exchanges. The volume of trade also increased enormously between 1850 and 1914. Okay? Now, of course, after that World War happens and the two World Wars happen, there's an interwar period, there's a Great Depression, all that happened in between. The worldwide circulation of British pound and Dutch guilder became very popular. These things became very popular. Also, not to forget, this was really the era of colonial rule, right? And the trade of grain, cottons, etc., these all boomed. And let me remind you, some of the big corporations as we know today, Coca-Cola, for example, emerged. I think it was in the late 19th century. Maybe the first experience of Coca-Cola came up around 1886. So basically, the journey started around late 19th century, which happens to be in this particular episode. Also, you see in this particular episode of globalization, trans-border commercial promotion, advertisements coming up. Now we come to the last current period of globalization, which is from 1980 onward. What we see now is a dramatic creation, expansion, and acceleration of worldwide interdependencies and global exchanges that have occurred since the early 1980s, that represent yet another quantum leap in the history of globalization. This is happening at a dramatically faster pace as compared to the previous era. Of course, technology played a key role, but also you have the bigger institutes, the international institutes like IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization. They're all working together. The countries are a lot more interconnected. The best way to characterize this particular episode of globalization would be a wave of globalization would be to say that there's some sort of convergence that is happening here. Now, there are different and widely spaced people and social connections coming together more rapidly than ever before. Clearly, the deregulation of national economies and the information and communication technology revolution, that has really played a key role. And it is happening at an unprecedented rate, compared to the previous eras of globalization. Now, internet, as we all know, had played a key role. What you see on your screen is that famous viral video, Gangnam Style, which became popular like in few months. And today it's much faster, right? We all are aware about the viral videos. So technology played a key role. Somebody sings a song in Sri Lanka and that kind of goes across the country. Something happens in India that goes across the country, across the world, right? So now it's time for you to think. Can you think of different eras of globalization? Before we move on to the last part of our discussion, we have already discussed various eras of globalization with a more focus on the current period of globalization, which is 1980s onwards. And to answer the question that we have raised, that can you think of different eras of globalization, of course you can go back and think of those historic and pre-modern and modern, early modern, and so on, and the current episode of globalization. And identify also, as you did think about these different eras of globalization, also identify what is really happening today that is very different from the past. It is not just the technology, although technology has played a key role in the whole diffusion of the spread of globalization, the way it is happening today. Okay, the last part of our discussion today is globalization and liberalization of the money market. So liberalizing the money market has been a key factor of globalization as we know today. Now, when we say the liberalization of capital markets, it's like funds for investment can be easily borrowed. Think about it this way. Like we all need some sort of fuel, let's say to cook at home, right? And we all get some gas connection. So let's say there is a cylinder at your home, but you're always concerned that, okay, max to max, I may have, let's say 2 or, depending on how many connections you have, you're limited by the number of cylinders that you have. So when you're inviting people, let's say for dinner or for lunch, a big gathering is happening, you're always worried about what if suddenly I run out of the fuel. Suppose there is a possibility that you can borrow from someone with the clause that the person can ask it back anytime the person needs. Of course, it opens up a lot of avenue for you. Something like that is actually happening here. It actually broadens the scope to borrow funds and whenever you need, be it for consumption, be it for investment. And this whole idea of liberalizing the capital market is that it's happening cross-bound, across the countries. It's like one country to another. Many countries together can be, borrowing money from one particular domestic context or some other, and they are deeply interconnected. Now, this has played a key role in kind of behind the pace of globalization, and it has been the rising trend since 1970s itself. There are broadly 2 theoretical perspectives here. One, of course, which says that it aids development because, especially for the developing countries, which may have some sort of, lack of enough saving. They may not have enough saving, so they can easily borrow as in the easily foreign capital can come into the, domestic, in the developing countries, and they can invest in, developing countries, which will help the growth process of the developing countries. Now, also, the argument is that now that you have, you can put your money, you can park your money in many countries. You can park your capital in many countries, many sectors. You're not limited by this country or this sector. What it does is you can manage your risk better. You can spread the risk across different sectors, different countries. So it's good in that way. However, the other aspect would argue that freer flow of capital has raised the risk of financial instability. And this is the topic that we'll explore more as we go along. The East Asian crisis, for example, of the late 1990s, is a glaring example of that, which happened in the Asian context. A lot of foreign capital came in, and then the crisis followed afterwards. We'll have a chance to discuss that as well. So that is an example of what the liberalization of capital market can do. Also, not to forget the very recent experience of 2008 financial crisis, which now again we are rethinking about as the Silicon Valley Bank actually collapsed. People are worried if something of that sort will happen or not. So it is a very fresh memory in our mind. So while there's a positive side to it, there's also a very, very serious side that I think about. Like there are serious consequences of capital market liberalization. Therefore, this whole idea of financial instability in a globalized context becomes such an important thing. So what you see on your screen, the different phases have been identified, where the blue part is where you have rising trade openness measured by export plus import divided by income, and the red part is where there's a falling the trade openness. I want to draw your attention to the last part. The post-global crisis, there is again some sort of a slowing down of the trade openness that has happened. So clearly you see that the financial issues have actually impacted the real sectors as well. So in the conclusion, what we are arguing that globalization is a multifaceted idea. There are both positive and negative consequences. There are different episodes of globalization which we have discussed briefly. And what we've also discussed that increased global integration, especially through capital market liberalization, that raises serious concerns over increasing financial instability, and there are strong supportive evidences in this regard. Thank you.